Good evening, guys. Thank you so much for checking out this evening's user group. I am Matt Goldman, and tonight I'm going to be talking to you about Automagic tenant config for mobile apps. So I'm going to break down a little bit about what those different terms mean, and I'm going to show you some cool magic tricks to see how we can make this experience magical for your users. Before we get into that, I would like to tell you about the Ssw Rewards Mobile App. If you haven't got this installed on your phone already, you need to install it now. You can find it by scanning either one of these QR codes, either for Apple or for Android, or you can just search for Ssw Rewards in your App Store. Now, this app is really cool. It lets you scan QR codes, and I'll give you another one later on this evening that will let you earn points, and you can use those points to claim rewards. So SSW, we've got some cool rewards. You can see some on the screen here. One of them is this Xiaomi Mi Band. The Xiaomi Mi Band is really cool. It's a very lightweight, simple device that's got fitness tracking, it's waterproof, really cool. And you can actually get this by earning rewards with SSW. Another one are these SSW Smart Keep Cups. So these lovely, cool branded SSW device, you tap the top, it shows you the temperature of the contents inside. I have one of these myself. I used it to bring my coffee in today, and it's very good. So yeah, install the app. We'll give you some more rewards points later. You can get more points for viewing more SSW videos and attending more SSW events. As I said, make sure you install this, and at the end of the presentation, I'll give you a code so you can earn some points. A little bit about myself. My name is Matt Goldman, and here at SSW, I'm a web and mobile developer. I do .NET Core and Xamarin, some other stuff as well. Those are my key areas. You can find me on Twitter at Matt Goldman. You can check out my blog, goforgoldman.com, and I've got a repo on GitHub as well, Matt Goldman SSW. You'll find me on there. You'll find all the code from this evening's talk on there as well. So tonight's agenda, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the history of tenancy, multi-tenancy, what those terms mean, how they relate to mobile apps, and what the problems are around configuration in different tenants. And I'm going to talk about config for web apps. You'll see here that I have a little green tick next to that, because with web apps, it's largely a solved problem. It's well understood, it's well accommodated. We know what to do to get your config into your web app for your different tenant, your different instance. And I'll talk a bit about how we do that. And I'll talk about what the difference is between that and mobile, and what the challenges are with mobile. And then we'll look at what the barriers are, and what the enablers are, and how we can get that config into your users' hands on their mobile device. And we'll talk about why that's a mundane way of doing it. We'll look at some mundane ways of doing it. And then we'll talk about invisibility, the magical way of doing it. And I'll explain why I think in the context of enterprise apps, why invisibility is the most magical thing you can do. So let's start. Let's talk about tenants, and let's talk about what we mean by tenants. So you can have a standalone app, and this is effectively a single tenant deployment. In this case, you have one instance of your app running for each of your different instances. Those are called tenants. That's called a single tenant deployment. It's a multiple single tenant deployment. In this example here, we've got tenant A, tenant B, tenant C. They're all running independently of each other, running on their own. Another way that you can do it is you can have a database per tenant. And in this case, this is what we call multi-tenancy. Your app is multi-tenanted. You have one instance of the app running, but each individual client or instance has their data in its own database. So you might have one client or tenant running tenant A in their database, and so on and so forth. You then have a catalog, and the catalog is used to enable your app to get the right data for the right user, the right client, from the right tenant database. That's one way of doing multi-tenancy. Then you can have shared multi-tenancy. And in that case, you have the one app and you have multiple users in the same database. So we've got here tenants A, B, C, and D in one database. We've got tenants E, F, J, and K in another database. Tenants L and tenants M have their own database, and we've still got that catalog so that that single instance of the app knows how to find the right data for the right user. Now, all of this, by the way, this is from this document here that I've linked to on the bottom of the screen. It's Microsoft's documentation about different tenancy patterns for software as a service solutions based on Azure SQL. And a really interesting use case of this, a really interesting discussion of this is Azure DevOps. And Azure DevOps actually went on a journey from the left side of the screen across to the right side of the screen. They started off having a single instance of Azure DevOps, single database, single app for every client that created a DevOps instance. And they found there were some problems with that. One of those was scaling. It just took more resources. Another one of those was cost. It cost money to run those resources, especially when you have a client that creates an Azure DevOps instance, which is free to do. So you can create these, and people do create them, and then they never use them again. So that cost money unnecessarily. So they went across to the shared database model. And then they found that the problem that they had was when they want to make a schema change, they've got to apply it to all these different databases. And what they did was they ended up going all the way across to the end, where now everyone's DevOps data is in one database, and every field in every table in the database has a partition ID, and that partition ID equates to a tenant. So that's how Microsoft did it. So, there's reasons why you would go one way, and there's reasons why you would go another. Let's have a look at those. So some of the pros and cons of the different approaches here. So you get a shared management overhead with the multi-tenancy model. And what that means is that you're running one instance of your data. Well, you're running one instance of your application in both of these models here. And you're running fewer databases. So that management is shared. It's that shared management overhead. And that then gives you an economy of scale. So it costs less money to run more instances of your application. You have a single set of configuration, and this is going to be the core thing that we're going to be looking at this evening. You've got a single set of configuration to worry about. You configure it once and it's done. Cost isolation. I should be clear, by the way, that these pros and cons, some of them apply to other scenarios as well. But what we're looking at here is what's the easiest way to do it, and what's the least amount of friction for each of these pros and cons. So cost isolation, yeah, you can do it in shared multi-tenancy. Of course you can, but it comes a little bit more difficult, and the easiest way to do it, if you want to isolate the costs of all the different instances of your application, is to have them all running individually. Administrative isolation. So we talked about the partition ID. Now, for people that are software engineers, we understand that the architecture of having a partition ID is secure. Right? So you can separate your data, you can allocate it to one client, one tenant, one organization, and we've got mechanisms in place through software, through different security mechanisms that isolate that data from each other. But the problem is it's not administratively isolated. You've got one administrator looking after all that data for all those different people. With the single standalone tenant, you don't have that problem. And you can offer multiple deployment models then. If you do offer it as a standalone app, people can run it on premises, they can run it in the cloud, you can still host it for them. You've got all those different approaches. And again, you can still do that through the other ones. But if you only offer it as a multi-tenanted, hosted by you solution, you lose some of that flexibility. So let's talk about what some of the disadvantages of the different approaches. Well, with the shared multi-tenancy, all your eggs are in one basket. So if all of your clients, and by clients I'm talking about the organizations that pay you to consume your software as a service, if they're all running on the one database and that database goes down, all of your clients are down at once. So that's something to consider. The other disadvantage with the shared multi-tenancy is that you have a single administrative chain of delegation. Now, what I mean by this is that if we look back at what I said about the administrative isolation, if you've got one partition ID, you can separate that data. So client A cannot access client B's data. It's secure, you can do that. There may be reasons due to compliance or regulatory compliance or other reasons where you might need to physically separate those. So it might be that if you're running a government application, it has to be in its own tenant, irrespective of the fact that separating it logically is just as secure. There are other reasons as well. But the problem is that even if you do accept that running it shared is fine, it's secure, client A cannot access client B's data, but there is a chain of delegation of those permissions, and it ultimately goes up to the one entity that is hosting those applications and those databases for your users. In the case of Azure DevOps, that doesn't really matter because Microsoft is hosting it for everyone anyway. The buck stops with them. They are the ultimate owners of, custodians of all that data for all those users, all those clients. when you're running a software as a service application for different users, it may be that they don't want the buck to stop with you, they want the buck to stop with them, in which case they need to have their own chain of delegation, as does client B, client C. So that might be one reason to look at single tenant deployments, multiple single tenant deployments. Another disadvantage here of the single tenant deployment, though, the opposite of some of the benefits we saw of the multi-tenancy, is that you do have a greater management overhead. If you are looking after multiple instances for multiple customers, you have to look after all of those. We'll touch on some of the difficulties around that a bit later on as well. And of course, you've got greater operational complexity. You're looking after multiple applications rather than one. So that's a look at the different approaches, the different multi-tenant approaches, the different single tenant approaches. So I hope you guys now have a good understanding of what I mean when I say tenancy, tenant, multi-tenant, single tenant. Now, the issue that we're going to be focusing on today is how do you get the configuration for individual tenants into the hands of users using a mobile app for the right tenant. So this concept of multi-tenancy, it's not new. And I said I'd talk about the history of it here. This is actually a screenshot of a blog from Scott Hanselman, from where he says he was talking about multi-tenancy at TechEd in 2006. So it is a problem that people are aware of, have been aware of, and talking about since at least 2006. But if we look at this Google trend here for the search term multi-tenancy, we can see that there's a spike there around 2006, probably thanks Scott Hanselman for that one. And you can see there's a couple of little peaks there, but it really starts to ramp up around 2012. And this correlates quite well with things we see around AWS and Azure adoption, things like Netflix, and these questions really starting to come into the enterprise mindset. And that's really when we started seeing the shift of enterprise applications to cloud really in a big way. Most organizations started their cloud migration strategy, or at least started thinking about it around that time. And of course, that's ongoing now. So it is a problem that's been around for a while, and it's one that people have been thinking about for a while. And what I want you guys to think about is, how do we make it seem magical? So we look at all these different tenants running in the cloud and all these different people running these different tenants, and it all just works for them. Is it magic? Well, no. Arthur C. Clarke, who, by the way, is a famous science fiction author and also the inventor, at least conceptually, of the communication satellite, he's got this famous quote where he says, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." And what he's saying is that we've got all these clients running, all these tenants running in the cloud. Seems like magic that you can just log in and you get the right one, but it's not. It's actually advanced technology. And that's what he said. And that's what we want to do, is we want to make it seem like magic. So to give you an example of how this is a problem in mobile apps, and how we have an issue when you run an app, but you've got multiple tenants of the back end, let's take WhatsApp as an example. Everyone installs the same version of WhatsApp, everyone logs in, and everyone communicates to the same back end. In this simplified example here, we're talking about an app service in Azure, whatsapp.com. It's simplified, it's a model, but the point is everyone connects to the same back end. You don't need any configuration in that mobile app for your users to use WhatsApp. Everyone uses the same WhatsApp service. How does that compare to something like Outlook? With Outlook on your mobile device, you've got a different situation. One user might install Outlook on their phone, and they want to connect Outlook to their Exchange server on their data center on premises. Another user installs Outlook, but they want it to connect to their Exchange server. And a third user, they install Outlook and they want it to connect to Office 365. So now you've got a problem, because all of these users have different sets of configuration, and those users need to get that configuration into their Outlook app on their mobile phone. So we're going to be looking at, how do you solve this problem? And to give you an example, and we're going to talk about how you solve this problem, I'm going to introduce you to Ssw Medman. Anyone that saw my previous talk, which was about a year ago on authentication, I created this demo app called Medman. And a bit of background about myself, I worked in health for about 10 years in a hospital. So the sample app, the demo app, is a medication management system, very basic, and it's just to show you how these mechanisms work. But for our scenario this evening, which is entirely fictitious, we're going to say that at SSW, we've developed this application called Medman, this medication manager. And what we've got here is we've got a marketing team who've been working really hard, and they've got some clients. First cab off the rank is going to be Royal North Shore Hospital here in Sydney. They want to run MedMan, and we're going to look at that example tonight of how we're going to get the config for Royal North Shore users. And they're going to be having a hosting company run it for them. We've also got Ssw Medical Centre, very, very interested in signing up for MedMan. They want to run it. They're going to run it on premises. We've also got the Mayo Clinic. They want us to host it for them. And we've got Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. They're going to be hosting it on Azure on their own cloud. And Walter Reed Medical Centre, I'm going to have a word with the marketing folks about that one, because that's actually supposed to be confidential. So we'll take that one off there. But let's look at these other examples. Royal North Shore, Cedars-Sinai, Mayo Clinic, Great Ormond Street Hospital. Okay, so we've got all these different users. They're all going to be running it different ways. And we need users at these organizations to access their own instances of their application. And for mobile, that's going to be okay. For desktop, sorry, that's going to be okay. But for mobile, they're all going to install the same version of the mobile app. How is that mobile app going to know which one to connect to? And that's what we're going to look at. So the requirements are customers will run their own instance of the application on their own URL. It may be that they host it, maybe that we host it, maybe that a hosting provider hosts it. We don't know. We just give them the application. And that URL might be RNS Medman, so Royal North Shore Medman.goforgoldman.com, Go for Goldman being the hosting company in this instance, goforgoldman.com/RNS Medman, or even RNS might host it themselves, medman.rns.com. We don't know at this stage. We need to be able to handle any one of those scenarios. But all customers will download the same app from the App Store, whether it's Google Play or iOS App Store. They're all going to download the same app. They're not going to get one that's individual for them. And you may know this, but App Store requirements don't let you publish an app to the App Store that is for use in one single company. So you get told that if you want to do that, you have to deploy it via an enterprise portal, which is another option. And if you do that, then you can provide a customized version for that company, but you're not allowed to release one publicly to the App Store that is just for one company. So in this case, we're going to release a generic version of the app. Everyone's going to download, and it's magically going to work for them. So with the web, how do you do this with the web? Well, it's basically a solved problem. You just give them the URL, and then they log in to their app, and there it is. And you can configure all the settings for that web app in the background multiple ways. So this is an app service running on Azure, and we use configuration, we use application settings, and that lets us configure environment variables. So specific bits of configuration for that instance of that app service, they can be put in those application settings, and they can be pulled in from other areas as well. Key Vault, lots of ways you can do it. There's a link there to the Microsoft documentation at the bottom there. You can also use DevOps. So you can use, we've got some YAML variables here. So in your pipeline, you can use variables to configure your app service differently. And by the way, those variable values can go into those app settings that we just saw on the previous slide. So these work together. You can also use this app configuration service, which is a new service in Azure. This is really cool. If you are running multi-tenancy, or if you're hosting multiple instances of an application, this lets you manage all those instances of that application through a single pane of glass and manage all those configs. That's really, really cool. That's a nice service. What we can see though is that, as I said, for web, it's basically a solved problem. There's lots of other solutions here that we haven't looked at, but for web, you configure it, your sysadmin, your developer, whoever, you configure it, it's running. You just give your user the URL. And if you're internal, if you're an enterprise user, you can even bookmark that for your users using group policy. Lots of different ways that you can do it, but it's done. You just give them the link and it's done. But with a thick client like a mobile app, or anyone that's been working for, the past couple of decades recognizes this horrible config screen. We looked at Outlook on mobile. This is Outlook on desktop. And back in the day, this is what you had to do. You had to enter all these fields. You had to put in your name, your email address, blah, 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 so on and so forth. And then you got the dreaded more settings button there as well. There's even more configuration that you can put into Outlook than just what you see on screen here. And that's not very magical. But nevertheless, it works. So why can't you do this for your mobile app? Well, you can. So as a user, of this MedMan system. I work at Royal North Shore Hospital, for example, and let's say I get this email here from my sysadmin, and I'll zoom into about there, and you get this email from your sysadmin, and it says, "Dear user, welcome to MedMan. Your access has been provisioned for you. Please refer to the attached instructions to find and use MedMan." Okay, great. So I can open these instructions that I got sent here. And we can see here, I have a nice set of instructions in a PDF file. Welcome to MedMan. To access MedMan, go to this link. Okay, so we can go to the link. Great, there's MedMan. Wonderful. Let's just go back to our instructions here. I'm going to pop that in a new tab. Okay, so let's just make sure we can log in. So I can log in. I click login, and I get this customized login screen here for Royal North Shore. Perfect. Okay, I can see that this is now my Royal North Shore instance of this MedMan application. So I'm just going to go ahead and log in. Okay, perfect. I'm logged in, and I can now use MedMan on the web. There's no problem there. I can use this MedMan application, and I'm good to go. But I want to use it on my phone. Well, how do I do that? Well, okay, to set up MedMan on your phone, first install it from the App Store and follow these settings. Okay, so let's go back to our screen here, and I can see that I have a form on the mobile app here, and I've got to put in some of this information that came from this PDF. Okay, well, this is looking a bit frustrating already. It's not a particularly nice form, but why don't I put that over there? Okay, and put this over here. Okay, so let's see, API URI. Well, I can see a URI there. I can see a couple. Well, okay. API base URI. We've got a value there for API base URI. That must be API URI. So let's put that in. Typing on a little screen keyboard on a phone is not a nice experience for putting in all this information, but okay, let's do it. RNS medman dot Azure websites.net. Yeah, I think I got that one. Oh no, I seem to have. This isn't a pleasant experience at all. Okay, .net. All right, never mind. Identity provider. Well, I don't have identity provider here in my instructions from my sysadmin. I have IDP, maybe that's it. Well, let's go ahead and put that B2C, tenant ID. Well, I don't have a tenant ID either, but I do have values that seem to correspond with the other things on the form. So let's go ahead and put the one that's missing, which is this domain. So RNS medman dot. No, that's auto filled for me. I didn't want that. Oh, now I'm really frustrated. I'm not happy with this app at all. But never mind. I'm going to persevere. And I'm going to make it work. Okay, tenant name. Well, I have a tenant name. Let's go ahead and put that RNS medman. So app/client ID. Oh, yeah. Really? I've got to type all this. That's not fun at all. Now, maybe I've got the email on my phone and I can copy paste these values. That makes things a little bit easier. But still, this isn't great. But let's see if we can get it in there. So AAA 6C753 dash, where's my dash? A354 dash 4C71 dash A98F dash. This is very tedious, isn't it? But never mind, we'll persevere, we'll get it to work. BFA 41C BCB E. Oh, I don't know whether that's a 0 or an A. I'm going to guess it's a 0. Okay, that's done. Next one, sign-in policy ID. Well, I've got this sign-in policy ID. Should we see if that's it? Let's try it. B2C underscore sign up and sign in. I don't even know if this is case sensitive. Do I have to put this as it is here? Well, let's see. All right, let's save that. Okay, so it's let me save it. It hasn't given me any errors, so I can assume at this point that it's correct. So I can go ahead now and try and hit this login button and we'll see what happens. Oh, look at that. So we got this error here. Well, look, I don't know what's gone wrong there, but we can take a guess, and we can guess that what I thought was that 0 was actually an O. So I could probably, try re-entering that, and maybe that would then make it work. But I'm not going to do that now, and there's no need to worry about that now. We can see that it's not a good experience. That wasn't fun. That wasn't something that me as a user really wants to do. It's prone to error. You can type things in wrong. If that config changes, what do? I'm going to have my sysadmin type me up a nice new PDF, send that to me, and then rely on me to put that back into my device. So that wasn't a good experience. So we can see here that this approach of having a form on your screen, well, look, it works. It didn't work then because I typed a 0 when I should have had an O, but it does work, and it can work, and it just takes a few tries for your user. We saw you got some problems there. So typing things in, how do you deal with config changes? It's not great. So, and the problem is when you have apps that frustrate your users to that degree, you can get bad reviews, and loose lips sink ships. Bad reviews sink good apps. It doesn't matter how good your app is. If your users don't like it, if you do one thing that frustrates them, they'll give you a bad review. And let's look at some examples here. So this first example I want to look at is Pokemon Go. So I'm sure you know Pokemon Go, but just in case you don't, one of the most successful mobile apps of all time. Incredibly popular. A couple of years ago, you would have seen people walking around looking at their phones, hunting Pokemon in the streets. People loved it. In fact, this person in this review opens their review by saying, great game. Great game, right? They love this game. And then they go on to tell a funny story about how it caused arguments in their family, tore their family apart. It's tongue in cheek. It's a joke, but they still rated it 1 star, right? Now this is Pokemon Go. Pokemon Go can absorb a 1-star review. Can your app? Maybe. Hopefully your app is that successful, but we don't want this, right? Let's look at another example. This is a review from Steam, and this is a review of a virtual reality game on Steam. And again, this review opens by saying, it's one of the best games I've ever played, but they've still given it a thumbs down, given it a not recommended. I have to give this a 0 out of 10 because this guy, while playing VR, broke a light in his room. Now, if anyone's ever played VR, you know well what the hazards are. And this is a joke review, but again, it's still giving it a thumbs down. So, that has real world implications there. Another one here, too much work. They haven't even gone into more detail there, but we can assume that this person has used our app where they've had to put all that information in the form, and that's just not present. It's too much work. So you don't want those bad reviews, right? You don't want those reviews. Now, we remember earlier on, we saw that Arthur C. Clarke said that any sufficiently advanced technology is distinguishable from magic. And what he's saying is that if it seems magical, it's not. There's tech behind there. But if you look at what this guy said, Gregory Benford is another science fiction author. He's got this great quote where he says, any technology distinguishable from magic is insufficiently advanced. So he's not just saying that if it's magical, it's not really, it's just cool tech. He's saying that if it doesn't seem magical, it's not good enough. And it's not a criticism of what we do. It's an aspiration, and this is what we should be aspiring to. So all of our technology that we work on should seem magical. And what do I mean by magical? Well, let's have a look. Let's see if we can make some magic. So, all right. So we've got our app here, and we've looked at this one way of doing it. That wasn't good. So let's get rid of that. We didn't like that. We didn't like that experience. It wasn't pleasant. So let's go back to our app. So we're logged in here. And another way that we can do this is our user is logged into the web app, right? So our user has the configuration already for their tenant. So how do we get that from here to here? Well, let's have a look. There are some cool ways you can do that. One way we can do that is like this. So we can see here that in this app, it says scan the QR code for Medman in your browser. Okay, well, that's an interesting idea. The code, the config is already in the browser. So let's see what we can do. Well, if we look up here, we've got this show config, and we can actually encode that configuration into a QR code here and give our user a QR code scanner on their phone. and pick it up that way. So I'm just going to move that over there and that over there, and we'll do that. So now we've got that QR code there. Can we scan that config? Can we scan that config? No. Okay, that's not working. Well, that's an option. You can do that. You can have your phone scan a QR code in your web app. You've already got the config there. Give it to the user. Okay, that didn't work for us. And there are some problems with this. And the reason it didn't work is because not every phone is equipped with the same quality of camera. Not every phone has a camera. Not every user wants to give their mobile app camera permissions. So you've got to accommodate that. Now, one way of dealing with at least not being able to read this complex a QR code is that instead of getting all that config and displaying it as a QR code, why not have the config published at a URL? Because that's actually what this is doing, right? The code here that's running in the browser is getting the config from the back end, encoding it into a base64 string and displaying that as a QR code. So in fact, if we go back to here, we can even see this. So if we go to rnsmedman.azurewebsites.net/API/config, which is where I'm hosting this from, you can see that that config for that instance is right there. So that's really handy. So if the config is right there, instead of encoding all of that config into this QR code, why not just get this URL and put it in the QR code? That's a perfectly valid deployment strategy, and that is actually something that I've done in the past, and that can work. So that's how we were doing this, right? And that's how you can make it a little bit better, is by just getting the config and just, instead of giving all the config, just give them the URL and let the device pull the config as well. Okay, so if you're already publishing the config at this URL, why scan the QR code? Why not just give the user a field to put the URL in to get the config? You can do that too. And in fact, in the real world, you want to do both. Because it's cool. The QR code is cool. It's really cool. It's high tech. You know, you use, scan this QR code. That's really cool. If it doesn't work, you want to give them the fallback option of putting the URL. So for these demos, I've done one approach per demo, but in the real world, you want to make sure that both are available to your user, because if they don't have a camera isn't working, they don't have access to the desktop to read the QR code, they need to be able to put the URL as well, and then they just need the config URL. Now, if you're eagle-eyed, you may have noticed that this is actually coming from the back end. This isn't coming from where my front-facing user app is coming from. So that's something to be wary of as well. So you need to send this to the user. But the problem is, it's still not that magical. The QR code is cool, but it's not that magical. And there's a quote here from the TV show Futurama. And this quote is actually from the character God talking to one of the other characters in the show. And he says, when you do things right, people won't be sure you've done anything at all. And the problem with the QR code or entering the URL is it's still something that the user has to do. And that's just not that magical. So let's look at another way we can do it. If we look back at our Outlook example, and this is Outlook on desktop, but Outlook on mobile works the same way. You've got all these fields. You've got to put in your name, email address, blah, blah, blah. It's not very magical. And you've got this more settings button that often you have to click on and you have to do the more settings. It's painful. Well, Outlook got rid of that, right? So let's see what fields that you don't need here. We don't need your name. That's already registered. You should be able to get that. Email address we'll keep, but account type, users they don't want to know about that. They don't want to think about that. That's something that your sysadmin has to give you as a user. You don't want that. Incoming server, outgoing server, username. Users don't expect to have a username anymore. They log in with their email. They use their email for everything. And password. We're certainly not going to keep the more settings. So what the users expect to end up with is their email address and their password. And that's what they're going to put in. And how can you make that work? How can you do that with a mobile app so that your user just puts in a password and their email address and password and doesn't have to put in all this other configuration? So here's a way that you can do it, right? What you can do is you can have the mobile app, the user enters their email address, and you grab the domain, the SMTP domain from that email address, and you send it off to a config broker. In this example here, the config broker is an Azure function. That config broker looks up that SMTP domain in a table. In this case, it's Cosmos DB. It's a config table that hosts the configuration for that tenant where goforgoldman.com has their tenant running. Gets the config, sends it back, sends it to the mobile app. Perfect. The mobile app now knows what its identity provider is and what its backend is. Now, you can have other bits of information that you might want to have in your config here. In this example, we might want to select other identity providers. You might want to use Azure AD. You might want to use B2C. You might want to use Auth0. You want to be able to choose. So you need to know who your identity provider is, and you need to know what the config is. You need to know where the back end is. That's this Medman instance up here, the app service. But you might also want to configure other things, like you might use mapping. You might want to tell your device whether to use Azure Maps or Google Maps, and then you need config for that as well. So all these different bits of config, you can see that the table then starts to grow. But for now, it's just got the identity provider and the instance of the back end. And that config table can host that for all your different tenants. And you end up with something like this. So your app sends the email address off, you get the config. And this is a perfectly valid architecture. This is something that you can do, and this is something that takes place in the real world. I didn't find some documentation for this specifically, but it's adapted from the idea of the identity broker from OAuth, from the OAuth standard. The identity broker concept is a little different, but this concept is adapted for it. And I looked for some documentation on that. And Red Hat's identity service has got some really great documentation. So I've got a link there that explains that identity broker concept. But we do still have some problems here. This is valid, you can do this, but we have some problems. One, if you publish this app and you host this config service, but all your users run their own tenants, and some of them might run it themselves on Azure, you might host it, they might run it on premise, you still have to maintain that config table. Because if you don't, the user puts in their email address, no magic. You can give them the fallback to the QR code, you can give them the fallback to entering the URL, but the magic's gone. Now, you might be asking, what's magical about entering an email address that isn't magical about entering a URL? The difference is the user expects to enter their email address anyway. They're expecting to enter their email address to log in with it. So they're going to put their email address in anyway. So to them, for that then to be able to go and get config for them, do everything in the background, they don't even know that, right? All they do is they put their email address in and they say, oh, is that all I have to do? So this works, and that lets you do that, and that's great. But why reinvent the wheel? And we are reinventing the wheel here a little bit, right? So instead of doing that, why not look at the other example that we looked at before, which was Outlook. And Outlook, as we saw, went from this to this. So you've gone from this complex form where you put in all this information, you put in all these details, to this, where all you put in is your email address. Now again, the eagle-eyed among you may notice here that that's very magical, but you may notice that there's this sign-in using a QR code. Now, I've never found in Outlook, in Outlook.com, in Exchange, Outlook web app, in the Outlook desktop client, Office 365, I've never found anywhere that gives you a QR code. So I think they saw this in one of the other apps that I've done and thought it was a neat idea and put it in. But either way, it's there as a fallback. So you have the email address and you have this too. So if we're not going to reinvent the wheel and we're going to look at Outlook, how do they do it? Well, let's look at our demo for pick a tenant, any tenant. Well, the way that Outlook do it is with a DNS record. So if you want to set up your email for the goforgoldman.com email domain, I want to set up my email for matt@goforgoldman.com. How do I do that? Well, I do it with a DNS record. So if I go to NSLookup to look up some DNS records, so I know my SMTP domain is goforgoldman.com. As the administrator of this email service and of this domain, what I do is I create a record called auto-discover. And Outlook, whether on desktop or mobile, knows that if I enter my email address as matt@goforgoldman.com, I need to go and find what is the DNS record for goforgoldman.com for auto discover. So I can put that in and I can see here that, great, I've got some records here. Now I'm running this on Office 365. So any user that wants to use a goforgoldman.com email address, they put that in and that will be found. That's great. That's great. Why don't we do that? Because we actually have the config here already. The config is already being published. So how do I get my user to get this config? Super simple. We steal this idea. Well, I can't do auto discover .goforgoldman.com because that's already taken. Outlook's already using that. So why not just pick our own, and we'll go discover medman.goforgoldman.com. Perfect. Okay, great. So we can see that discovermedman.goforgoldman.com has a DNS record for it. So why don't we see how this works with our mobile app? So if I go to this window here, okay, so we can see now that what the mobile app is saying is it's just saying enter your email address. Okay, well, I know my email address. I don't need to look that up from a form that's been sent to me by my sysadmin. So I'll just go ahead and put it in, matt@goforgoldman.com. And if I hit save, that's going to go and look up. So we can see now that it hasn't given me any error. So what it's done is it's extracted the goforgoldman.com SMTP domain. It's looked up Discover Medman record at that site and it's found it. So it's now saying I can log in. So now if I hit log in, I should be able to log in without an error like we saw last time. And we can see here's my login screen. It's for Royal North Shore. I'm at the right tenant. I've got the right login information and I've already put in my email address. It's already there. So I don't need to put that in again. So all I need to do now is enter my password and sign in, and away we go. And that will now give me access to all of the information and data from my tenant. So that's great. So why don't we have a look at how that works? So we saw a few things there that were a bit more magical than this. The first thing is we put in our email address, which we were already expecting to put in. So let's have a look. So what I've got here is the code for the mobile app. It's all in Xamarin, and this is available, as is the backend, on GitHub at my repo that you got the link for earlier. Now this is the main one here. We can see here that we've got this form where you've got to enter all this data. We're going to ignore that for now. We can see that you can do the scan the QR code and you can enter the URL, but we're going to look at entering the email. So now if we look at this view here for our config page, we can see that we literally have one entry, which is just email. And that's using binding back to the view model here. And we can see that once the user enters that, we go to the view model. And what we do is we've still got all this information that we need to get, that the app needs it for configuration. But instead of the user entering all this, first thing we do is we pass the email, right? So we pop it through to this, this isValidEmail method. And what that does is uses a regex to make sure that it is actually a valid email. If it's not, it returns, and you've got to do it again. Then what we do is we run it to another method, which gets the domain from the email address. So we pop out that email address. And then what we do is we get that domain and we create a URI for discovermedman.domain/API/config. Now, if we have a look here, we know the domain is goforgoldman.com. And if we do discovermedman.goforgoldman.com, we get the record is this one. So if we get the record for this discovermedman.goforgoldman.com, the URL it's going to give us is rnsmedman.azurewebsites.net. The code is going to pop that into there, and it's going to go to API/config. And we know that if we go to discovermedman.goforgoldman.com/API/config, we are going to get that config. So all we needed was this part, was the domain, the SMTP domain, and we were able to get that config. Magic, right? The user just had to enter their email, which they were going to do anyway. They don't need to know about anything else happening behind the scenes. They enter their email and everything just works. The last magic trick that I want to show you here is that once we've got that config, we saw that the email address was already in there. They didn't have to enter it again. So that's done because we're using B2C in this case, which is an OAuth. It's an OAuth compliant identity service. And OAuth defines this thing called login hint. And if you provide a login hint, and we're using the Microsoft authentication library here in the mobile app, and that lets us pass this in as a property with login hint, and we're adding this email address there. And then when it displays the login screen, that email address is already populated. If you're not using the MSAL or you're not using B2C, you can still pass login hint as a parameter, as a URL query parameter to your OAuth login, and it will pop that email address or username, whatever you pass as a login hint, it will put that in the username field for you. Magic. So we said, pick a tenant, any tenant, and we saw that all you had to do was put in your email address, and from your email address, we can then say, is this your tenant? So we use your email address and we get your tenant. So using your email address, we know that you're Royal North Shore. We know that that's where you can find it, RNS Medman for goldman.com. Magic. I want to talk about one other way of doing it. Now, I think that's the most magical way because it's invisible to your user. They just give you your email. They give you their email, which they were going to do anyway. I want to talk about one other way of doing it, one final way. And I don't have a demo for this, but if you look at a popular way of doing it, is the way streaming services do it. So Stan is a streaming service here in Australia, and streaming services often run on people's games consoles, because you have it in the living room connected to your TV. You can run it on your phone as well. Games consoles, it's difficult to type in a username and password because you have to use a controller. So instead of doing that, you run the Stan app on your games console, on your PlayStation, your Xbox. It gives you a code and it says, go to stan.com.au/activate and enter this code. You go to stan.com.au, you enter that code, that then pings back to the instance on your console, and that logs you in. Plex, another streaming application, does it the same way as well. And another more enterprising example is Azure Cli. So with Azure Cli, instead of logging in at the command line, you do as login. That then tells you to go to microsoft.com/device login, put in the code, and then it logs you in. So that's the final way of doing it, which is also might seem like magic to your average user. In an enterprise app, multi-tenancy, different configs, you've got to get that config to your user. The best way to do it is get them to put in their email address. And the best way to configure that at the back end is to get the administrators of that domain or that tenant to create a DNS record that lets your app look up your config for that domain. Now that might not work. You don't have to maintain the table then, they maintain it themselves. They might not have put the record in. So you want to have the fallback of let them enter their URL, let them enter their QR code. Worst case scenario, let them enter the form. But the first thing you want to do is make it magical. So my summary of this evening is, first of all, we looked at the history of multi-tenancy. We looked at some definitions of what multi-tenancy was. Then we looked at config for web apps. We looked at how you can get the config into your web app, how it's a solved problem. We looked at what the difference is between that and a mobile app, what the problem is there. And lastly, we looked at how to make it magical. Now listen, I really enjoyed putting this together. I really loved researching the history of this. I loved working on the demos. For me, making that magic, making it invisible for users, that's the best part of my job. So I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you. Thank you so much. And one more thing. I promised you at the beginning that I was going to give you a QR code that was going to give you some points. So let's have a look at that. We have a QR code here. If you've installed the Ssw Rewards app, you can scan this QR code. This QR code is specific for this talk, and you can scan that QR code and that will give you some points for this talk. You can use those points, you can collect them up, and you can get some of these cool prizes that we're looking at here. So that's really cool. So I'll come back to this and put it back on in a moment. But the last thing I would ask is that if you have any feedback about this demo or any other questions, you can scan this QR code and that will take you to the survey for tonight's talk. There will be a link on YouTube as well. Thank you very much, guys. I really, really appreciated giving you this talk tonight, and I really enjoyed it. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. For SSW TV, I'm Matt Goldman. Thanks very much.